Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, good morning everybody. Hope you are enjoying yourself so far. This morning I'm going to continue on the suttas in this booklet that you have got, very nicely made by the organizers. And the sutta I'm going to start off with this morning. Hopefully I won't be going on too much longer before we start on the gradual training. But the sutta this morning is called Ignorance. And this is from the Samyutta Nikaya, from the Magga Samyutta, which is in the 45th Samyutta and the Samyutta Nikaya. So Magga Samyutta is all about the Eightfold Path, right? The Arya Atangika Magga. And this is the first sutta of this particular Samyutta. And the purpose of reading is this particular sutta is to understand how the Noble Eightfold Path works. And as somebody mentioned yesterday in the question time, the Noble Eightfold Path is not just 8 factors put together randomly. There's a certain sequence to these factors. And this is one of the things that this sutta shows, is how that sequence actually works. And that one factor leads to the next one, all the way to the very end of the path. And the other reason I want to just focus on the Noble Eightfold Path first before I go on to the gradual training is because what you find in the suttas is that the suttas always mesh with each other. They always rely on each other, they relate to each other, they are complementary to each other. So when you look at the gradual training, you can actually see the Noble Eightfold Path also in the gradual training itself. One way of looking at the gradual training is like an expansion of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's all there, it all matches together almost perfectly. And this is one of the beautiful things about the teaching of the Buddha, is precisely that it is so harmonious. It actually functions as a complete whole. It's like all these little pieces that make this beautiful jigsaw puzzle, and that is the teaching of the Buddha. So let's have a look at this, and then we will see later on how it relates to the gradual training, etc. It's quite a short sutta. I'll probably just read the whole thing, and then we can discuss it a little bit afterwards. So this is how it goes. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, those bhikkhus replied, and the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, ignorance is the forerunner in the entry upon unwholesome qualities, with shamelessness and fearlessness of wrongdoing following along. For an unwise person immersed in ignorance, wrong view springs up. For one of wrong view, wrong intention springs up. For one of wrong intention, wrong speech springs up. For one of wrong speech, wrong action springs up. For one of wrong action, wrong livelihood springs up. For one of wrong livelihood, wrong effort springs up. For one of wrong effort, wrong mindfulness springs up. And for one of wrong mindfulness, wrong concentration springs up. Because true knowledge is the forerunner in the entry upon wholesome states, with a sense of shame and fear of wrongdoing following along. For a wise person who has arrived at true knowledge, right view springs up. For one of right view, right intention springs up. For one of right intention, right speech springs up. For one of right speech, right action springs up. For one of right action, right livelihood springs up. For one of right livelihood, right effort springs up. For one of right effort, right mindfulness springs up. For one of right mindfulness, right stillness, samadhi, samma samadhi springs up. So that is this little sutta, and you can see straight away the causality there, the chain of events, right, starting from right view. Actually here, starting from right understanding, right view, and then all the way up to the end of the Noble Eightfold Path. So you can see the causality there. And of course, when you have a causal chain like this, because one thing relies on the one previous to it, the first factor is very important, right? It's like when you look at dependent origination, the most important factor in dependent origination is probably the first one, avijja, because that shows you where the problem, the beginning of the problem is. And in the same way, with this Noble Eightfold Path, because right view is the first factor, without right view, at least to some extent, the rest of the path cannot follow along. So the first factor is so important. So let us look a little bit at this first factor then, because it is so important. What actually can we do to kind of build up the first factor in our life, to make sure that we kind of get started on the Noble Eightfold Path? So what here, the Buddha is saying here is that ignorance is the forerunner in the entry upon unwholesome states. Right? If you are ignorant, you tend to do unwholesome things. The word states here is dhamma, it means like qualities, specifically mental qualities. So what is this ignorance then? And the Pali word for ignorance, as I'm sure many of you would know, is avijja. And of course the opposite of that is vijja, is understanding. So what does this actually mean? And it's important, it's useful to get a grasp, get some idea of what actually ignorance means. Because once you understand something, you can actually start to apply yourself in the right way regarding these things. And of course the most common understanding of avijja or vijja, the opposite side, one of the most common ones is the te vijja, right? The te vijja, the three knowledges, they are, according to the Pali Suttas, the understanding of past lives, understanding of rebirth more precisely, the understanding of karma, and of course the understanding of the end of the asavas, the enlightenment understanding. These are the three vijjas. And avijja then is basically ignorance about these things. More specifically, ignorance about the Four Noble Truths is how it's usually defined. But that is a bit kind of difficult, right? It doesn't really help us all that much because, okay, past lives, most of us don't really know about past lives. We may accept it on confidence in the word of the Buddha, but we don't really know it. There's a big difference between confidence and knowledge, right? And it's important to acknowledge that there is that big gap there between confidence and knowledge. So what more specifically does it mean? And what more specifically it means is avijja is not seeing in terms of the way the world actually is, whereas vijja is seeing the world in the way that the world operates. This is the meaning of yatha bhuta nanadassana. You see the world as it actually is. And vijja is very closely related to that. Things like understanding rebirth, when you see that, you see this is actually the way the world is, right? For the first time in your life, the knowledge arises and you see it fully for yourself. So if this is what it means, we need to ask ourselves, how can we kind of align our own understanding with the way the world actually works? If you can align your own understanding, your own view with the way the world actually is, well then that is right view, right? Right view just means this is the world is, this is the way the world is. I'm looking at the world in the way it actually is. That's all it means. It's almost like science, right? If you want to be a good scientist, you're trying to find out how the world works. Well, this is kind of the Buddhist equivalent. We're trying to find out what the world actually is like. So how can we do that? And the first way of doing that is simply by reading the suttas. When you read the suttas of the Buddha, the suttas are basically right view, right? That's all it is. It's the Buddha expounding the way the world is and telling us about the path and all these different factors. So when you read the suttas, it's like you are imbibing, you are drinking right view, right? And after a while, that drinking a right view becomes part of you. And you slowly, you start to align yourself according to that view. Provided, of course, that you believe what the suttas say. If you don't believe what they say, then you have a problem. But if you have enough confidence in the Buddha to actually have that faith, that feeling that this is the right thing, then gradually your view starts to align with the way the suttas work. So reading the suttas, how do you actually read the suttas? Well, the first thing, of course, is just to read them, and read them for yourselves. Don't just come listening to somebody like me. When I come here and teach, it's all very well. And of course, I try to be honest, I try to tell you what I believe the Buddha said. But sometimes when you read it for yourself, it's much more powerful. It's much more powerful because you are now in charge. You have to think about what this text is saying. When I say things, it may sound very nice, but sometimes you don't understand properly, you don't take it all in, and sometimes it's too easy just to listen. But when you have to look for yourself, that is often when you really come to a much deeper understanding. So you read the sutta, and then the second thing to do is to reflect on the content. You see this, the Buddha says this throughout his teachings. You read, you contemplate what you have read, and only then, when you contemplate it, does it actually really sink in and become something powerful in your life. So this is the first thing. You have these suttas. Well, you can imagine the suttas as this whole thing of right view, right? It's all right there. This is just right view, that's all it is. And then you drink in that right view, and slowly your own view starts to shift, and it gets into line with the right view of the Buddha. So this is the first way of moving in the right direction, of getting the path started, is by actually coming to understand these teachings. There's more to it, and one of the ways, of course, of contemplating the Dhamma, you know, I'm sure you're all familiar with the three characteristics, the tilakkhana of the Buddha's teachings. The tilakkhana, of course, are the idea of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, right? So these are the three lakkhanas. And sometimes, for a person who has confidence in the Buddha's teachings, you accept that these are the characteristics of existence. It's good to reflect on these characteristics. What do they actually mean? What do they mean for me? And sometimes when people talk about the tilakkhana, they talk about sitting in meditation and watching things rising and passing away and all these things. That may be fine, but that is not the way I would recommend reflecting on these things. Because unless your samadhi is very good, you're not going to go very far with that kind of contemplation. Much better to look at your own life and start to understand the tilakkhana in terms of your own life. And what is a good place to start? A very good place to start is the contemplation of death. Contemplation of death is nothing but vipassana practice, yatabhutananadasana, seeing things as they actually are. When you contemplate death, you're contemplating anicca, right? The body is going to pass away. The body is going to disappear. All your relations are going to disappear. All your friends are going to disappear. All your belongings are going to disappear. Very powerful anicca sanya. It's dukkha sanya because it is painful to lose all your relations. It's painful to lose all the belongings that you have accumulated in this life. It's painful to give up the body. You know, we look after this body, we dress it up, we kind of make sure it looks nice throughout the life. And suddenly, after spending so much time trying to make sure the body is all right, we have to chuck it out. And then we get a new one instead, right? So that is difficult because we have to let go of the things that we are attached to. So it is dukkha sanya. It also is anatta, contemplation of non-self. Why? Because you know you have no control over these things. You cannot choose whether you're going to die or not. There's one certainty in life, we're all going to die. That's just the reality of things. So it's anatta, you can't control it. It's a process, an inexorable process that drives you to the destination of death. No choice in the matter. So there you are. It's a very practical way of contemplating the three characteristics instead of some kind of artificial way of thinking, not artificial I should say, but some very high dhammas of thinking in terms of the five khandhas or whatever. Bring it down to earth, something you can use for yourself. Then it becomes really powerful. And there are suttas. I think maybe I have an extract later on of these suttas. Well, the Buddha specifically says that any man, any woman, whether a householder or one gone forth, should reflect on such things. And he mentions marana sanya, the perception of death or dying. He talks about illness, old age. He talks about the fact that you're going to lose all the things that are beloved and pleasing, right? I'm sure you know this sutta. That's a very famous one. And the last one, that you are the heir of your karma. You're going to take your karma with you into the future. So these are basic, simple ways of reflecting on impermanence, suffering, and non-self. And you can expand that even more. You can bring the perception of death very close to you into the present moment, right? One of the problems with the perception of death, we tend to think it's going to be in the future. You think, oh, I'm only 25, I'm only 35, I'm only 65, right? People think like that as well. It's still a long way before I'm going to die. But death is so uncertain. And this is one of the beautiful things, maybe beautiful is the wrong word, one of the powerful things in monastic life. I go to funerals quite often, and when you go to funerals, you see that people of all ages die, and it makes it very clear that this is true. It is not certain that we are going to live to a ripe old age of 70 or 75 or 80. You can die when you are a small child. You can die as a baby. You can die as a teenager. You can die in your 20s. We just don't know. This thing is uncertain. And that is when the perception of death becomes powerful, when we realize the uncertainty. And that if I'm not prepared to die now, I will never be prepared. Now is the time to be prepared. Not tomorrow, not in 5 years' time or whatever. Now is the only time because of the uncertainty of death. And this is how you bring impermanence, dukkha, and all these things close to you as in your practice. So that is a very hands-on way of actually looking at these things. Okay. And of course, another way perhaps of acquiring this right view is also to think about things like rebirth sometimes. It is very common these days to be skeptical about rebirth. People think, oh, is there really such a thing as rebirth? But if you have a bit of confidence in the suttas, you have some confidence in the word of the Buddha and what he says, it's very difficult to dismiss rebirth as a fantasy. You have to take it seriously. Okay, you may not know it is true, but at least I think there are very good grounds for taking it on board as on confidence that there is such a thing as rebirth. And people sometimes think that the idea of rebirth, it contradicts the ideas of modern science, etc. And I don't think that's true at all. I think if modern science does come to understand the mind, then eventually it may have something to say about rebirth. But scientific understanding of the mind and the brain is so poor that basically science doesn't know. That's the reality of it. And as long as science doesn't know, we have the right to place our confidence where we think it is worthwhile placing confidence. Okay, so that is just a little bit about ignorance and how to change your mind from ignorance towards a view that aligns with the way the Buddha looked at things. And of course, if you have the ignorance, if you don't understand where suffering lies, if you don't understand that anger leads to suffering, that it is suffering, that doing unwholesome things is suffering and it is a problem, then of course you give rise to those unwholesome states. You don't restrain yourself when you feel angry. You don't hold back. You don't think, wait, be careful, this is dangerous. You don't hold back from breaking the 5 precepts, right? Because you don't really understand suffering, where suffering lies. So then all these unwholesome states happen, and then you don't have the sense of shame and the sense of fear of wrongdoing. These very important words in the Pali, hiri and ottappa, these 2 words. And ottappa is just, I shouldn't do this because the consequences are bad. It's going to lead to my own suffering in the future, going to lead to the suffering of others. So right understanding leads naturally to this. And hiri is just a sense, when you do something, you feel bad afterwards. You feel, I shouldn't have done that. That wasn't very nice. You feel a sense of unpleasantness inside of you because you have done something you know wasn't right. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. We all have these feelings every now and again. And that is what hiri, or sense of shame, actually means. It's not a sense of you should punish yourself, anything like that. That's a completely different thing. That's called guilt feeling. That is a very different thing. This is just a sense of feeling kind of impure and not feeling nice when you have done something that you know is wrong. And according to Buddhism, it's a good thing to feel that. If you feel a sense of shame, it's positive. You should be happy that you have a sense of shame. people who don't have a sense of shame are the people who end up doing lots of very bad things in this world. If you look at people, the really bad people, like people who are psychopaths and these sort of things, very often they have absolutely no sense of shame inside. They do these things and they don't feel anything. And that, of course, leads to enormous problems in the future for themselves and for others. So be happy that you have a sense of shame. There's nothing to be ashamed about. So that is what happens. So we have the hiri-ottappa, and then the right view starts to get established. And then, when right view is established, then you understand, I must be a good person, right? And then when you understand the intention to be good arises, then the path factors of right speech, right action, right livelihood, which is all the virtue factors of the path, they come into existence. Once you have the virtue factors into existence, then right effort. Right effort is once the basic virtue has come into place, right effort is the one which drives the virtue even further, also into the area of the mind. It's the more the kind of refined virtue, right? And then you get, as the virtue becomes more and more powerful, the mind becomes very pure, meditation becomes possible. And that's what samasati is. It's just basically the ability to meditate. You are able to be in the present moment. Your mind doesn't go all over the place. So you're able to watch the breath. That's samasati, the ability to watch the breath or any other meditation object. And then the last purification happens through a practice of samasati, and it also brings the mind together, unifies the mind, and then samasamadhi happens as a consequence of that. So that is how the path works, one factor after the other. If you don't have the first factor, it is impossible that this path can take off. This is the way the path has to work. Okay, so there you are. That is the sutta on ignorance. I think probably that is enough. I'm not going to go into a great detail about how these path factors condition each other. Maybe later on we can look at that. I think that will become clear anyway as we go through the suttas, how these things condition each other, how you move from one to another one, stage by stage. So now I want to move on to what I consider the main sutta for this retreat, and this is the shorter discourse on the simile of the elephant's footprint. And as I mentioned before, this is the first sutta that was spoken when the Arahant Mahinda came to Sri Lanka. So for that reason, it is obviously quite a profound discourse, and not only was it spoken by him, but I also find this sutta very beautiful. There's many beautiful aspects to it. So let's see what this sutta has to say on the gradual training here. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Now on that occasion the Brahmin Janusoni was driving out of Savatthi in the middle of the day in an all-white chariot drawn by white mares. He saw the wanderer Pilotika coming in the distance and asked him, "Now where is Master Vachayana coming from in the middle of the day?" "Sir, I am coming from the presence of the recluse Gautama." "What does Master Vachayana think of the recluse Gautama's lucidity of wisdom? He is wise, is he not?" "Sir, who am I to know the recluse Gautama's lucidity of wisdom? One would surely have to be his equal to know the recluse Gautama's lucidity of wisdom." "Master Vachayana praises the recluse Gautama with high praise indeed." "Sir, who am I to praise the recluse Gautama? The recluse Gautama is praised by the praised as best among gods and humans." "What reason does Master Vachayana see that he has such confidence in the recluse Gautama?" Okay, so that is just the introduction there to this sutta. And sometimes, I'm not sure how much I should go into this, sometimes people say, oh, all these suttas, they start with Savatthi on the top. Does that mean that all the suttas were spoken at Savatthi? Sometimes there are so many suttas spoken at Savatthi. And one reason for that, why so many suttas are spoken there, of course, is that the Buddha is supposed to have lived there for a long time. But another reason is that sometimes, I think, when monks didn't remember where the Buddha had stayed, the default was Savatthi. That was like the default place, right? So where did the Buddha stay again? We've got to put this in the beginning of the sutta. Can't remember. Okay, put Savatthi. It's a bit like that. And actually, I'm not just saying that because it's my personal idea, but there are some other suttas in Sanskrit, or actually it's in Chinese translation probably, and they say that specifically, if you cannot remember where a sutta was spoken, you should put Savatthi in there, specifically what it says. And this points to an important thing when it comes to understanding the suttas, and that is that there is a difference in the sutta between the Buddha Vajna. The Buddha Vajna is what the Buddha speaks, and the narrative material around it. It is obvious that the Buddha Vajna, that is what everybody hears when they're there, right? So that is what is remembered straight away. Whereas the narrative material, the material around it, was obviously added afterwards. Somebody else had to add and say, okay, we have to add this thing about where it was and all these things. If you look at the first council of Buddhism happened in Rajagaha 3 months after the Buddha passed away. At that council, when Venerable Ananda was reciting the suttas, Venerable Mahakassapa, he would ask him, where was the sutta spoken? And he would say, at Rajagaha. Concerning whom? And he would say the people about whom the sutta was spoken. So in other words, at that time, the narrative wasn't yet part of the sutta. That was a separate issue that had to be asked about. So these are things that came afterwards. And that is, it's quite interesting, I think also important to some extent, because it means that the narrative material, you don't take it as seriously as the actual word of the Buddha. It is not so important. And when you do a comparative study of the suttas, you look at the Pali, you compare it to the Chinese, you compare it to the Sanskrit, or if there's a Tibetan version perhaps, you compare them, you find that although the doctrine of the Buddha, the actual teaching is almost exactly the same in all the different languages, sometimes we find the narrative material can be different. The sutta took place in a different place. The number of people who became enlightened at the end of the sutta often is very different, etc., etc. So that is just a small thing about how to interpret the suttas that I like to make a point of. And perhaps it is more relevant for the monastics here than for the lay people, because it's a fairly subtle point. And then you have this Brahmin, Janusoni. He was quite a famous Brahmin at that time in Savatthi, and he was a very staunch disciple of the Buddha, and he was obviously a very wealthy man. You can see he was driving here an all-white chariot drawn by white mares. I think that's kind of the Mercedes of the of those days. So just like now, nothing has really changed in the world, right? In those days too, they wanted to have the nice chariot. Now we want to have the nice chariot. It looks slightly different, but essentially it's the same kind of thing. Humans haven't changed that much. It's important to realize that, because sometimes people think, at the time of the Buddha, everybody was so pure, everybody was ready to get awakened, and now everything is kind of declined. But people are just people, right? People have defilements. They had defilements then, they have defilements now. Some people are very pure, others are less pure. Nothing is really, and I don't think anything is all that different now than it was then. If you think it is different, then it turns you off the practice of the path, because you start to think it is impossible and very hard to do. And then you have this beautiful phrase here when he meets this Wandra Pilotika, and he says, what do you think of Master Gautama's wisdom? And he says that, how can I know about the Master Gautama's wisdom? Well, surely one would have to be his equal to really understand. And it's an important point, that sometimes it's good to admit that maybe some other people have more wisdom than you have. And sometimes to be a bit humble about that and say, okay, maybe I don't know. I have a kind of a temporary opinion about things. I have a sense of confidence, but probably I don't know. And this is the relationship that, we should have with the suttas. This is the word of the Buddha. Sometimes you don't understand. Sometimes you think, this doesn't make any sense. I can't believe in that. But then sometimes you say, okay, I can't believe in it, but let me not just throw it out. Maybe it's just my lack of understanding. So you keep an open mind about these things. You don't become too judgmental about what is in the suttas. Personally, I have found that is a very useful way of dealing with the suttas. When you start off, there are many things I couldn't really fathom or agree with. But as time has gone by, you have actually understood how it all fits very beautifully together. And actually even things which seem really strange actually probably have a basis in truth. Sometimes there are strange things in the suttas, though. Sometimes there are things that are wrong, perhaps. And you can see that again through comparative studies. There may have been a corruption in the sutta. So it's important not to take everything on board with faith either. Sometimes you just suspend judgment. You say, I don't know. And that is actually quite a good attitude to have. Okay, so then after having praised him so much, then Janusoni the Brahmin asks him, what is the reasons for this high degree of confidence that you have in this recluse Gautama? And then he gives us his reasons for his high degree of confidence. So these are those reasons. Sir, suppose a wise elephant woodsman were to enter an elephant wood and were to see in the elephant wood a big elephant's footprint, long in extent and broad across. He would come to the conclusion, indeed, this is a big bull elephant. So too, when I saw 4 footprints of the recluse Gautama, I came to the conclusion, the Blessed One is fully awakened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, the Sangha is practicing the good way. What are the 4? Sir, I have seen here certain learned nobles, the Kshatriyas, right, who were clever, knowledgeable about the doctrine of others, as sharp as hair-splitting marksmen. They wander about, as it were, demolishing the views of others with their sharp wits. When they hear the recluse Gautama will visit such and such a village or town, they formulate a question thus, we will go to the recluse Gautama and ask him this question. And if he asks like this, he will answer like this, and so we will refute his doctrine in this way. And if he is asked like that, he will answer like that, and so we will refute his doctrine in that way. They hear the recluse Gautama has come to visit such and such a village and town. They go to the recluse Gautama, and the recluse Gautama instructs, urges, rouses, and encourages them with a talk on the Dhamma. After they have been instructed, urged, roused, and encouraged by the recluse Gautama with talk on the Dhamma, they do not so much as ask him the question, so how should they refute his doctrine? In actual fact, they become his disciples. When I saw this first footprint of the recluse Gautama, I came to the conclusion, the Blessed One is fully awakened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, the Sangha is practicing the good way. Again, I have seen certain learned Brahmins who were clever, etc. And exactly the same thing happens again. And they too become his disciples. And when I saw the second footprint of the recluse Gautama, I came to the conclusion, the Blessed One is fully awakened, etc. I saw certain learned householders, and the same thing happens. I saw certain learned recluses, these are the samanas, right, the shramanas of ancient India, who were clever, and the same thing as before, for sharp as hair-splitting marksmen, etc. They do not so much as ask him the question, so how should they refute his doctrine? In actual fact, they ask the recluse Gautama to allow them to go forth from the home life into homelessness, and he gives them the going forth. You see the difference here, that the recluses, the samanas, they don't just become disciples, they actually go forth. That's the difference from the previous ones who were all householders. Not long after they have gone forth, dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute, by realizing for themselves with direct knowledge, the here and now enter upon and abide in that supreme goal of the holy life, for the sake of which clansmen rightly go forth from the home life into homelessness. They say thus, we were very nearly lost, we were very nearly perished, for formerly we claimed that we were recluses, though we were not really recluses. We claimed that we were Brahmins, though we were not really Brahmins. We claimed that we were arahants, though we were not really arahants. But now we are recluses, we are shramanas, now we are Brahmins, now we are arahants. When I saw this fourth footprint of the recluse Gautama, I came to the conclusion the Blessed One is fully enlightened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, and the Sangha is practicing the good way. When I saw these 4 footprints of the recluse Gautama, I came to the conclusion, and saying the same thing again. When this was said, the Brahmin Janusoni got down from his all-white chariot drawn by all-white mares, and arranging his upper robe on one shoulder, he extended his hands in reverential salutation towards the Blessed One, and uttered this exclamation 3 times. Honor to the Blessed One, accomplished and fully awakened. Honor to the Blessed One, accomplished and fully awakened. Honor to the Blessed One, accomplished, fully and awakened. Perhaps some time or other we might meet Master Gautama and have some conversation with him. So that is then the reasons that he gives for having this profound confidence in the Buddha. And of course the interesting question is here, is he right to have this kind of confidence in the Buddha based on what he has seen? What he has seen is basically he has seen that people are becoming disciples of the Buddha, people who have strong views about things, and they're trying to convert the Buddha or change the Buddha's mind or defeat him in debate at the very least, and then they actually end up becoming disciples instead. Is that really enough grounds? And the answer, of course, is no. That is not enough grounds for becoming, to recognize somebody as fully awakened. So the interesting question is that how do we go about deciding whether somebody is fully awakened? And the rest of the sutta is really about that. But on a more preliminary level, if the rest of the sutta is basically about how we ourselves end up becoming fully awakened. And of course, when you are fully awakened yourself, that's what the sutta says. I'm just giving away the ending now, but it doesn't matter. It's not a movie, so it doesn't matter so much. So the ending is that when you become fully awakened yourself, then you know that the Buddha also was fully awakened. But before we get there, what are the right ways of deciding whether somebody is a good teacher or not? How do we decide these things? And I think in the modern world it is such an important question to ask ourselves, because when I travel around I see so many teachers of all kinds. I see so many people going and saying, oh, this teacher is an arahant, this teacher is a sotapanna. And often it is on such flimsy evidence. The evidence is non-existing very often. And very often the evidence that people have for one teacher being an arahant or one teacher having this or that, very often it's just what other people say, right? The more people say, this teacher is great, the more likely is that other people too will be saying the same thing. Yeah? So it's like this momentum building up, right? And if we look at the history of the world, we look at some of the teachers that have been proclaimed as great spiritual masters, and very often they have turned out to be frauds later on. Like Rajneesh, the famous spiritual guru of the 1970s or 60s or whenever he was around, he basically, he obviously had some very powerful qualities about him, a lot of charisma, a lot of ability as speaker and all these kind of things. But in the end, it turned out that either he became corrupted by his fame, or perhaps, I don't know about this, but maybe he probably was a little bit corrupted from the very beginning. Yeah. So it is important, this ability to be able to pick out who is a real, who can we actually trust when it comes to the Dhamma. And just to follow up on this Rajneesh thing, also when you go to places, go to Thailand, for example, I'm sure the same thing is happening here in Sri Lanka. I don't know the situation in Sri Lanka that well, but if you go to Thailand and you talk to people, then whoever they have as a teacher, they will normally say he's an arahant or she is an arahant. This is kind of the standard thing here. Because that's what we want, right? We want our teacher to be spiritually attained. Otherwise, why do you take them as your teacher? So there's this bias in the mind which tends to see arahantship or see spiritual attainment simply because we are a disciple of a person. So what we have to do instead, we have to be very careful with that sort of thing. We need to be honest. We need to look ourselves. We need to be independent. You must judge for yourself whether somebody is worthy of your confidence or not. That is the right way to do it. Don't let yourself be blinded by what other people say here. How do you judge this? And the way that the Buddha recommends in the suttas to judge whether somebody has attained anything at all is simply to watch their conduct. So much can be seen through somebody's conduct, and specifically the Buddha says you should watch for things like greed, specifically anger and delusion. These are the three things. So how does this person, probably the most easy one of those three things to see is anger, right? Anger is very obvious. You can see it on somebody, on the external qualities of somebody, whether they're angry or not. And then you know the mind state. That is actually the first way of reading the mind of somebody, is by just looking at the external signs. And we can, generally speaking, the Buddha said that we can judge somebody's behavior in this way. You may not make an absolute judgment and say this is absolutely certain, but when you see something that looks like anger, there should be a little bit, okay, I better be careful in this particular case. This person may not have the qualities that I think they have. And certainly, they're not going to be an arahant if they get angry here. So this is the first thing. So don't be afraid of looking at spiritual teacher and seeing what is actually there. Too often people say, a spiritual teacher becomes angry. Oh no, he's not really angry. He's just, playing around, or he's just kind of being fierce but not angry. But don't get caught in that kind of idea. When the Buddha says that we should judge in this way, there's a reason why the Buddha says that. It means that we can actually make a reasonable judgment for ourselves on these external signs. And in this way you become very independent. You become like, I take charge of my spiritual life. Instead of, being part of like a guru, having some guru who can take you this way and drag you that way and brainwash you and all kind of things. You become in charge of your own spiritual practice. And how powerful, how wonderful that is to be in charge instead of being tricked into something which is can be very dangerous sometimes. So this is the first thing, you watch somebody. The second thing is to watch them over a long period of time. The Buddha says you shouldn't make hasty judgments, but you should keep watching over a long period of time. And only when you have seen somebody over a long period of time can you make a reasonable judgment about who they are, whether they have good virtue, whether they have wisdom. The Buddha says specifically you need to discuss with somebody to understand their wisdom, and other factors of the personality as well only come out after having known them for a long time. And then comes the real catch. That is, you have to be wise yourself to be able to see these things in other people, right? Now that is, that is a bit difficult, because sometimes we feel that we are not all that wise perhaps. But I think most of us have enough wisdom to be able to see these kind of basic things. So whatever wisdom you have, that's all you have anyway. There's not much point in saying my wisdom isn't good enough so I can't do this. Well, you are where you are, so you've got to use what you have. But at least you know that wisdom is required. That makes you more careful in your judgment. Sometimes people say, I haven't got much wisdom, so I will listen to what they say instead. But if you listen to what they say, well, how do you decide? How do you decide what they say is valid? You decide it with your own wisdom, right? So it comes back to your own wisdom regardless. So just judge for yourself. That's the best way of doing it. And then it says also that you have to be attentive. You have to have manasikara, yoniso manasikara. You have to be attentive when you watch somebody else. You have to be attentive, you have to be wise, you have to watch over a long time, and you have to trust your own judgment at the end of the day. So that is how we come to some understanding of which spiritual teachers are worthy of our trust. And of course, if somebody doesn't have any anger, if they haven't got much greed, if they haven't got much delusion, you will also see the opposite side as well. You will see the metta, you will see the compassion, you will see the kindness, you will see the peace in people, right? So not only is there the lack of the bad side, but the good aspects will also be very prominent in that person. And then you can place confidence. But still, you still don't know, right? One day they may disappoint you. So don't cling too hard, don't attach too much. Have confidence, but not too much attachment to the person. Because if they disappoint you, if they turn out that you were wrong in your judgment, then you are able to withdraw that confidence and maybe go back to the Buddha's teachings again, or whatever it is. So all of these things are just ideas on how to place confidence in the right teachers. And this is all taken from the suttas. What I'm repeating to you now is just basically the word of the Buddha himself, how he said we should deal with these things. And very beautifully, because of course the Buddha himself said that this is how you should investigate me, right? He said, you should look at me. Do you see any states of greed, hatred and delusion in me? That's what he said. And the implication was that if you see those things, of course, then you shouldn't have any confidence in me. But of course the Buddha knew that he didn't have those states, so he felt very safe in saying that. And that is a very beautiful example of a spiritual teacher. Watch me. Am I living up to the standards that I claim that I should be living up to? I claim to be an arahant. Do I have the qualities of an arahant? You judge. And if you find that I'm worthy of it, then you should place your confidence in me. So that is what we do. And then, of course, that is how confidence arises. And then that confidence then often becomes either stronger or weaker depending on the situation. And eventually, if we do practice the path, that confidence turns into knowledge. And that knowledge, turning into knowledge, is what we find in this sutta, how confidence becomes knowledge over time. So, that is all about about confidence and knowledge. And of course, quite nice here how these people all become the disciples of the Buddha. The Buddha just teaches them and gives them a nice Dhamma talk. And then instead of trying to argue with the Buddha, that confidence comes. And this is the beautiful thing about coming into the presence of somebody special. You get a natural confidence, right? I noticed that in myself. You come to somebody who is very peaceful, very kind, very kind of different from ordinary people. It's very hard not to get confidence because you sense that there's something special here, right? There's a feeling about the person. And this is what happens to these people. How is it possible that you come all that way to argue with somebody, but actually instead of arguing, you become disciple instead? How is that possible? It is because the person you're with is so impressive, not in a worldly way, but in a kind of low-key way, right? Very peaceful, very kind, very gentle. It's something very powerful there. And when you see that, you can't avoid getting confidence. And the Buddha says elsewhere that one of the great things in the world is just seeing an arahant is one of the wonderful things in the world. Just seeing an arahant, because when you see an arahant, you get this particular feeling, right? Wow, there's something strong here, there's something powerful there. And that is what happens. So this is what happens in the presence of the Buddha. And this is what happens also in the present day. If you find somebody very special, very unique, there's a natural confidence that tends to arise. Okay. So, that is what he said, and he was obviously then able to convince the Brahmin Janusoni that something was special here, and this Brahmin Janusoni then says, honor to the Blessed One, etc. And that phrase, there is the Pali phrase, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa, is that particular phrase. So they use that phrase already at the time of the Buddha, it seems. And then we have him, we have a few minutes left, I can maybe go a little bit further. Then this Brahmin Janusoni, he goes to the Buddha. And it continues as follows. Then the Brahmin Janusoni went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down at one side and related to the Blessed One his entire conversation with the wanderer Pilotika. Thereupon the Blessed One told him, at this point, Brahmin, the simile of the elephant's footprint has not yet been completed in detail. As to how it is completed in detail, listen and attend carefully to what I shall say. Yes, sir, the Brahmin Janusoni replied, and then the Blessed One said this. And this is where the sutta proper really starts. So of course the elephant's footprint is the idea he has seen this footprint of the big elephant, just as you see the elephant footprint in the jungle, in the same way you come to a conclusion about the Buddha. But as the simile here will show, even if you see a big footprint in the jungle, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a large elephant or it is a large bull elephant. Sometimes there might be, as it says here, a she elephant that has large feet or whatever. and then you might actually be mistaken. There's more. You have to actually see something directly with your own eyes to know something. That is the point of this thing here. And there's a couple of minor points in this paragraph here which is interesting. You will see here that the Buddha always exchanged greetings, and he has amiable and courteous talk with the person that comes and meets him. And this is invariably the case in the suttas. The Buddha is always he's friendly and approachable, right? He always says a few nice words. To feel comfortable, we have to talk a little bit to each other, right? If we remain completely quiet, sometimes it gets a bit awkward and a bit sort of, you're not sure whether the other person is nice or not. So it's good to say just a few pleasantries. And even the Buddha did that. So it's nice to keep that in mind as one of the examples. Okay, maybe I think I will stop there, even though there are a few minutes left, because now we are really starting on the sutta proper. And if I go into the sutta proper, I will sort of have to stop halfway, which is a little bit silly probably. So I think I will just stop at that. Does anybody have any question they would like to ask straight away? Any burning questions that they would want to ask? We have 5 minutes left. Everybody content with that? Okay, so we'll just call an evening, and we'll continue later on this afternoon.